Hi everyone, I'm Samantha Page. I'm an urban planning student at the GSD, and this afternoon I have the privilege of introducing our last panel. So, fittingly, after 2 days of retracing the steps of Olmsted's legacy from the Civil War South through New York and New England to the Philippines, China, and Europe, and back across North America today, this panel asks us to reckon with the several selves of Frederick Law Olmsted. It's a daunting task, but I'm sure that our panelists are up to the task. So briefly, I'll give a bio and we'll just get right to it. We begin with our fearless organizer, Ed Eigen, presenting Papering over Olmsted. Ed is senior lecturer in the history of landscape and architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. His scholarly work focuses on intersections of human and natural sciences with the built environment in the long 19th century. Then Catherine Sievett will present Seeds, Grafts, and Offshoots, Olmsted on and off Staten Island, 1848 to 1857. Catherine Sievett is a professor and director of the Master of Landscape Architecture program at the Spitzer School of Architecture at City College of New York. Her work explores adaptation to climate change in urban environments and the novel transformation of landscape restoration practices. Finally, we conclude with Charles Birnbaum on the road to the Olmsted Renaissance. Charles is president and CEO of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and prior to creating TCLF, he served as coordinator at the National Park Service Historic Landscape Initiative and worked in private practice focusing on cultural landscapes and urban design. So without further ado,
Samantha, thank you for that and for everything. So because this phrase has become so familiar over the weekend, I'm not an Olmsted scholar. I'm a scholar who periodically writes on Olmsted, and this is an example of that. And I also realize at a very late hour that what you're about to hear might well be considered my homework for this conference, so be it. There we go. There is a deft form of self-accountancy, bookkeeping, if you will, in Olmsted's modest assessment of his worth on paper. Strike that. Make that his worth in paper. In a letter to Maria Griswold van Rensselaer, one of several they exchanged while Rensselaer was preparing a biographical sketch of him for Century magazine, Olmsted conceded, "As to my books, I write tolerably only with exceeding labor. My best book was The Journey in Texas because edited by my brother." John Hall Olmsted's effort stitching together a narrative from the journals kept by his brother, the book's nominal author, lends nuance to the concept of genetic criticism. But Olmsted offers a more pointed measure of his literary capabilities in another letter to Rensselaer, complimenting her for her essay on the art of gardening. He says, "I suppose that I have spoiled quires of paper, laboring vainly to say what you say fully in half a page." For Olmsted, writing was a Georgic task. Labor omnia vincit. Labor will be the death of all of us, except for that part of our labor that endures in writing, including the notes and drafts. But is it quires that will be will it be quires that will be measured in the balance? A quire, the industrious editors of the papers of Frederick Olmsted explain in Volume 5, The California Frontier, is 24 sheets of writing paper. And honestly, it's not really nearly that simple. That particular annotation accompanies a letter from Olmsted to his father, a dry goods merchant well-versed in taking stock, discussing his draft of a report on the operations of Mariposa Estate. So, how many quires of paper does it take to settle the books on a gold mining operation? Several, it seems. And how much to account for a lifetime of labor in distinct but adjacent fields, themselves connected by paperwork. Well, anyone who has spent time reading a cereal box knows that contents are measured by weight, not by volume. What follows is a proposed study of a life in paper and/or a life of papers. Let's call it the Possible Olmsted Papers, or POP. And finally, I can claim to be a pop historian. I face a lifetime of inscrutability. Okay. An extended moment around the Olmsted sesquicentennial produced numerous accounts of Flo, as he was dubbed in the title of Laura Woodroper's meticulously researched biography. Other versions of this singular figure in the landscape have since appeared. The author of one of these volumes suggesting that Olmsted attracts biographers because, like Twain, Melville, and Whitman, he was that, quote, quintessential 19th century American character, the self-invented man, thus self-made man. In this, Olmsted's bicentennial, it is as timely as ever to ask, of what stuff did Olmsted invent himself? Which might not be the same stuff out of which Olmsted continues to be reinvented. Working between, around, against, indeed so many prepositions fit, that vast editorial monument, the Papers of Frederick Olmsted, 12 volumes hereinafter referred to as FLOP, and its quarry, the Frederick Olmsted Papers at the Library of Congress and Fairstead, the Possible Olmsted Papers takes a page from one of Olmsted's own favorite books, which is Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus, or The Tailor Retailored of 1831. The editor-narrator of Carlyle's proto-postmodern didactic novel seeks meaning and order within bags filled with, quote, miscellaneous masses of sheets and oftener shreds and snips written in his subject, that is to say, Professor Teufelsdrosch's scarce legible cursive schrift, his terrible handwriting, which will sound very familiar to anyone who studied Olmsted. The lesson for us: the Olmsted we know is past perfect. It is time to retailor him, to take meaningful measure of the miscellaneous papers, rebalance the books, and reevaluate what is trash and what is treasure. The inspiration and material grounding for this approach is found in the paper trail, an unharvested furrow left by Olmsted's 7-year labor on an unrealized book, A History of Civilization in the United States, Hereinafter Civilization. The fragmentary manuscript betrays Olmsted's intention to, quote, connect a series of personal observations, incidents, and anecdotes. Full quires of paper are used like herbarium sheets to preserve newspaper clippings, some of them carefully annotated, others hastily torn from the daily papers, with some fleeting editorial point in mind. They are works of collage as much as a faithful record of authorial intention as they are hesitant gestures at argument and exposition. Had these elements cohered as planned, and Olmsted drafted numerous successive outlines for them, they would have illustrated the crucial role played by the pioneer settlement, or what Frederick Jackson Turner later famously or infamously described as the frontier conditions in the self-invention of American character. A note left by one of these would-be editors reads, quote, the matter has not yet been sorted or arranged with any care and contains much repetition in material and ideas. Chapters on Mariposa are the only ones of possible biographical value. And I'll want to come in a moment to think about how we compose a biography, a life in writing. Here, like gold embedded in veins of quartz, was precious evidence of the real and emblematic westward course of Olmsted's career. But in making connections between and within Olmsted's literary remains, do we simply read from east to west and back again, like the ox turns while plowing? And what of all the scattered, unsorted, and repetitive material, the editorial slag that is left behind when the seemingly relevant bits have been extracted? The Civilization manuscript presents other paratextual markers, including letterhead, that provide displaced milestones in Olmsted's biography, while at the same time providing a continuous medium for his episodic writing. As noted by the editors of Flop, the manuscript's earliest sections were written on the back of a draft report Olmsted prepared as General Secretary of the Sanitary Commission. And here we can put the biography in place. And John spoke about this so beautifully yesterday. At the behest of Reverend Henry Bellows, Olmsted left his work at Central Park, itself a remedy for the innovation of city life, to devote his surpassing administrative and logistical skills to the Commission's medical relief and work for the Army of the Potomac. Learning of his departure for California in 1863, Bellows wrote to Olmsted, quote, "I have the gravest objections to your taking yourself out of the center of affairs and giving to Mariposa what belongs to your country and mankind." It's a dual charge. It was during the same period, again, thank you, John mentioned yesterday, that Olmsted was working to promote his paper, as he called it, the Journal of Opinion that became The Nation. But I'll skip over that. But Olmsted had debts to pay, including those from a failed investment in an earlier publishing house. The Golden State beckoned. Mariposa Company letterhead then tells the tale of Olmsted settling into place or restlessly moving from place to place not only within a nation riven by sectional strife and the dispossession of indigenous peoples, but also between the several selves that uneasily coalesce in a biographical whole. A still later part of the manuscript was penned on the back of prospectuses dating from 1869, produced by Olmsted Vaux and Company, thus Recto, subdivisions for villa and summer residence in Riverside, Illinois, the seed of the American middle landscape. Verso, the incomplete story of the barbarity of the frontier. Olmsted made plans on paper, including plans for himself. But what was he writing on? This question is evidently meant in a double sense. The topics he wrote about and the material support, the paper he wrote on, both are topical. But it was Olmsted Jr., in a letter to the editor of the Boston Herald, who confirmed his father's selection of landscape architecture as a designation for his professional work. But at the same time, Jr. considered the appropriateness of a name derived from the Greek word topos, or a locality or a piece of the earth's surface, as found in the Latin topiarius, the man who lays out places, as an apt description of our field. And it should be known the first degree that was given out in Harvard was called Artis Topiarius. As the editor with Theodore Kimball of his father's professional papers, Jr. was the first to confront how Senior, or Olmsted Polytropos, who became landscape architect by turns, might be pieced together and cut down to size, at least in paper. So as the topiarist with his clippers, the tailor with his shears, the editor with his scissors. So let's get to work. The possible Olmsted papers is given shape by a literary genre, minor to the point of vanishing, namely the papers of Bigelow, Potiphar, Sparrowgrass. Here, a planned patchwork, a miscellany of authorial mannerisms make the man. And I'm thinking of Buffon's style as the man himself. The Potiphar Papers was the invention of Olmsted's friend George William Curtis, who was a literary editor at Putnam's magazine when Olmsted himself was managing editor. An article in that magazine titled Our Authors and Authorship, discussing the work of Curtis and Herman Melville, claimed that, quote, the series of papers on the, as he called it, the fictional Paul Potiphar, have done more for Curtis's reputation than any of his other writings. As for Melville, suffice it here to mention that the Websterian manner of spelling seen in Benedetto Sereno, A Story of a Slave Ship Mutiny, is attributable to Olmsted's editorial hand while at Putnam's. The papers were meant to be sketches of the, quote, meant by Curtis to be sketches of the, quote, vices and follies, the odious and facetious aspects of American society, then as singularly exhibited by the parvenu Potiphar. No lover of books, Potiphar had learned enough from the daily newspapers, to know that his house and furnishings needed to reflect, as a matter of aspirational taste, the, quote, 50,000 he had made that year alone in Timbuktu bonds. New forms of cash and credit, especially paper money, were straining conventional notions of property and propriety. American literature of this period, which Potiphar himself was unlikely to have read, seemingly, is populated with counterfeiters, confidence men, and note passers, all trafficking in the fictional designs of banknotes. But even if in his daily papers, alongside Olmsted's economic reports on the slave states, Potiphar could have read about the US Navy's expedition to perform, quote, reconnaissance on the continent of Africa eastward of Liberia. Agents of the state, adventurers, missionaries, and not least of all, the American Colonization Society were charting ever-expanding horizons of speculation. And in the rarefied literary republic to which Olmsted himself coveted entry, the fates of Benito Cereno, Potiphar, and the fabulously far-off Timbuktu were more tightly bound than might at first appear. But the signatures do not always align. In his criticism of Curtis, William Dean Howells, editor of the Atlantic Monthly and the so-called Dean of American Letters, argued that the Potiphar Papers, quote, should never have been united under one name, for they do not form a whole. So you stand in for your own name. To assume a name, so to adopt a local habitation, is to put a specific face on things. For fugitives, as Olmsted was to observe in his travels through the slave states, freedom depended on urgent self-fashioning, a change of name, gesture, clothing, etc. And the curious mistranscription of an advertisement for a runaway, included as a specimen in Olmsted's book, further suggests the ways in which an identity can be, in a sense, doctored. As it happens, one destination for fugitives in America was Timbuktu, an agricultural colony in the Adirondacks for free blacks, its utopian promise compromised by the region's unpromising soil. Safe in his own selfhood, Howells notes that there was, quote, some sketchiness of handling in some of Curtis's characters, and that certain people, quote, not only change their aspects, but their characters in different papers while they keep their name. What Howells asked for was that the Potiphar Papers, again, originally serially published in Putnam's magazine, achieve a sense of consistency that a life and papers often fails to deliver. What is a biography if not a longing for closure in discourse, the sense of an ending, to use Kermode's famous phrase? So, for example, in one of the Potiphar papers, in one paper, Potiphar has, quote, a library of bookbacks, or rather expensively crafted leather spines with no pages within. And it is later said that, quote, he reads and enjoys Thackeray. There is no contradiction here, only confirmation of Potiphar's own capacity for literary self-invention. He explains that he keeps his library cases locked and always pretended the key was lost when asked by anyone to take a book down. The bookbacks were a, quote, good investment in leather, for it brought him the reputation of a reading man. Well, a moment ago, it was Curtis's reputation as a writer that was being burnished by the Potiphar Papers, and now it's Potiphar himself. And especially because we just talked about the word friction, I want to put emphasis on that word burnish, which is not just a question of polish, or rather Horatian purple prose. I want, in this greater project, to give focus to the irreducibly material factualities and fatalities of writing, of erasure, and selfhood. To burnish is to put a shine on things by wearing down their surface, but it's also a question of usage in its more than double sense of wearing away. And one can think here of those inscriptions Olmsted found in the suburbs of Savannah that were mentioned yesterday by Sarah in her beautiful talk. Olmsted writes, I spent some time, and remember, reading and writing, time always figures into the equation. He says, I spent some time in examining the inscriptions, the greater number of which was evidently painted by self-taught Negroes. And the syntax for him betrayed their station in life and their access to education. And thus, Olmsted transcribed them, quote, as literally as possible, noting of one for a Baldwin that at the end, the remainder was rotted off, and of another for Margaret, sand drifted over the remains. This is the material bearers of these meanings. And of this paper that I'm trying to address now, we have to think of the paper as the remains of what remains. So, moving toward a conclusion. just give a couple of examples, more examples of these papers I've been trafficking in. The Sparrowgrass Papers, or Living in the Country of 1856, can be seen to present an anamorphic mirror of Olmsted's own halting progress from semi-hapless scientific farmer to vaunted landscape architect. Putnam's magazine was evidently the preferred medium for such misadventures, its editors expressing their, quote, natural pride that Frederick S. Cousins' comic satiric series of the Sparrowgrass family's Flight from the City first appeared in its pages. In recollecting the thought pattern, really a paper trail that led from the prison walls of the metropolis to life amid blossoms and leaves, for that is what he had been expecting to find in the country, Mr. Sparrowgrass leafed through his commonplace book, and commonplace book is already a complex paper-based technology for recollection and as an aid for writing. In turning over some of its yellow pages, out tumbled, quote, a wilderness of scraps that were lying perdu between the pages. This scattering of subliterary leaves, like the newspaper clippings collaged by Olmsted, was the source of Sparrowgrass's anticipated rural joy. There were lists of climbing plants to ornament his imagined cottage, jotted down from Thomas More's poem Lalla Rookh, or An Oriental Romance. This was the same source of poetic inspiration that later provided the name of Vale of Kashmir, popularly given to the section of Olmsted and Vaux's Prospect Park. Then slipped out a list of rural ornaments for gardens and some more, quote, scraps of the same kind, memorandum, Downing's rural architecture, landscape gardening, a few hints from Lord Bacon, et cetera, et cetera. The term memorandum, significantly as it appears in the name of Madame Baudereau, French is Baudereau is a memorandum or note, from Henry James's Aspern Papers, speaks of a collection of papers, a list of particulars. The Sparrowgrass Papers presents a regular ruus ex libris, in which the writings of Downing, Olmsted's own tutor in the field of rural literature, lived on. One last example. James Russell Lowell's Biglow Papers of 1848 offers an unserious but poignant reflection on what it means for an author to be wrapped in paper. Lowell, a longtime acquaintance of Olmsted and an appreciative reader of the Cotton Kingdom, addressed his own concerns about slavery and the Mexican-American War in the Yankee dialect verses of one Hosea Biglow. But within the book's Shandian apparatus, it is the pedantic Reverend Homer Wilbur who ushers Biglow into print, and not without a regret peculiar to himself. Quote, I confess, writes the pastor of the First Church of Jalam, which in Hebrew it means hidden, that there is, to me, quite a new satisfaction in being associated in a book which could stand by itself in an independent unity on the shelves of libraries. Wilbur's own sermons, he explained, were destined to languish in an undistinguished heap until they were given, quote, such resurrection as is vouchsafed to them, mummy-wrapped with a score of others in cheap binding with no other mark of distinction than the word miscellaneous, that word again, printed on the back. But as Potiphar well understood, many readers never get past what's written on a book's spine, especially those factitious books which are under lock and key. So, to conclude, truly now, what sort of person emerges from the papers of? An independent unity? Well, an entity, a face, a name. As for the possible Olmsted papers, the ambition is to document the multiplex essence captured by Charles Eliot Norton. Of all Americans, Norton said, Olmsted stands first in the production of great works which answer to the needs and give expression to the life of our immense and miscellaneous democracy. For Norton, emphasis was on Olmsted's standing, his status as first among equals. An avatar of Western civilization, that's to say, Norton was far from preaching the gospel of the average man, the Whitman average man. But for our purposes, it is the miscellaneous element that stands in high relief. It allows us to elect possible and perhaps necessary Olmsteds, so long as there are papers, as long as the papers are in order, or in some form of elegant disorder out of which he can be remade. So, what is a lifetime if not an accumulation of paper, some of it trash, some of it treasure? We can read, for example, the inventory of the goods and chattel accompanying the last will and testament of James Olmsted, who emigrated to Cambridge in 1632, which included 15 quires of paper valued at 6 shillings 3 pence. Along with account books and receipts and check stubs, there is also to be found in the Olmsted papers dispatches on his struggle with what Alexander Pope memorably called "this long disease, my life." So other papers. A letter from Edward Wood, professor of chemistry at the Harvard Medical School, informs a bedridden Olmsted that he has detected a very decided trace of arsenic in a sample of his urine provided to him by Olmsted's physician. One might find clues in Wood's influential report on arsenic as domestic poison regarding the appearance of the turkey red wallpaper installed at Fairstead, by which Olmsted believed himself to have been infected. But what about the survivability of the paper itself? Upon learning of a fire that consumed an outbuilding at his Staten Island farm in 1863, Olmsted wrote to his brother, quote, "It saddens me to think of the destruction of my many manuscripts and helps to strengthen an unpleasant sense of being cut off from my past life." My paper is myself, cut off, scissored, edited by the miscellany of life circumstances, and yet, in what remains, in unaccounted for quires, are to be found many more possible Olmsteds. So please stay tuned, but not for more of the same. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ed, for that great talk, as well as the invitation or maybe directive to participate in this Olmsted Bicentennial. I'm honored to be part of the panel with you, Ed, and also Charles and Samantha, keeping us all together. And thanks again, Paige, Kat, Samantha, and Matt. You guys are fantastic. I am not an Olmsted scholar, but I'm a scholar of George E. Waring Jr., who was his sanitary engineer or drainage engineer. So what I brought to you today is from a footnote in one of those papers in which we discover that George E. Waring rented a room in one of the farms on Staten Island. And when I discovered this footnote, I thought, and Olmsted was unhappy because the rent was past due. So he complains to his father that George hadn't paid his rent. But in any case, I was curious about this farm on Staten Island, of which I did not know. So we'll speak a little bit about that farm today, but also 2 drawings by Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted spent 10 years, from the age of 25 to 35, on and off his 130-acre Thomasock farm on Staten Island with its extraordinary views of the Raritan Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. This paper explores the seeds sown there from 1848 to 1857 and the voyages that departed from and returned to this island that were critical to his pursuit of what is now called landscape architecture. In addition, I will dwell on 2 of Olmsted's drawings. And we can see actually in this image from the atlas from 1874, the farm property as it appears with the subsequent owner. Let's see if I can zoom us in. We're on the south shore of the island here. And you can see at the division of Southfield and Westfield, what was on this map shown as Dr. Anderson's farm. He was the subsequent owner, but you can see the property here extending from the road all the way to the beach. Olmsted explored his identity on Staten Island as a farmer, a writer, and an editor. Despite this focus on the land and the landscape, it's possible that perhaps what Olmsted most enjoyed was the farm's adjacency to the watery realm of the sea. 5 years earlier, as we heard yesterday from Desiree, he had come to New York with the dream of becoming a sailor. As a young man, Olmsted also developed his interest in various authorial guises deployed in his earliest writings. He wrote under several pen names in these texts, aliases that reflected the lenses through which he would voice his written opinions: Wayfarer, for his report on his walking tour of England in Liverpool's Birkenhead Park. Yeoman, you can see here, in fact, that signing off as the wayfarer. Yeoman for his chronicles of agricultural tours through the slave-holding states of the American South for the New York Daily Times. That would result in his book, The Cotton Kingdom, and An American Farmer for a report as part of those tours on a utopian farming community. Sorry, I'm trying to advance that. There we go. He would sometimes sign his letters to his younger brother John as a Greek, and then in parentheses, Ola, a play on agricola, or the Latin word for farmer. Indeed, Olmsted's point of view as an author was that of a farmer, albeit a well-heeled gentleman farmer. And his ideas of the connection of the landscape and public health, evident in his later work, would emerge from that view. On January 1st, 1848, Frederick Law Olmsted's father, John Olmsted, purchased a farm for his 26-year-old son on the southern shore of Staten Island, New York. It was the second such farm, the first being in Sachem's Head, 70-acre farm on the southern coast of Connecticut, near the family's home in Hartford, purchased by the elder Olmsted when his wayward son chose to try his hand as a scientific farmer. The much larger Staten Island farm, 130 acres, purchased from Samuel Ackerley and renamed by the Olmsteds as Tossamick Farm, would be the second farm abandoned along Olmsted's path to becoming a landscape architect, a path that entailed a detour into a writing career. Both farms were located on the Atlantic coast, with views of the sea. Indeed, Olmsted's beautiful nautical prose appears in a letter to his brother John Hull Olmsted on March 6, 1848, describing his dramatic voyage, moving both his furniture and his potatoes for the market via 54-foot single-masted sailboat, the Juliet, from Sachem's Head Farm to Tossamick Farm at Great Kills. And he writes, "My sofa went lengthwise in her. The chests, chairs, etc. were in the staterooms. The sailboat sailed west along the Long Island Sound and south on the East River through the Narrows, encountering ice floes and a snowstorm before arriving safely at Great Kills, where Olmsted's possessions and potato harvest were unloaded." This is an image of a very similar vessel. The foundations of the Ackerley farmhouse, which we know today as the Olmsted Beale House, date from the 17th century, 1685 to be exact, and these early 20th century photographs reflect quite accurately how it would have appeared during Olmsted's time here in 1840s and 1850s. One of Olmsted's earliest drawings is an undated sketch of the Staten Island farmhouse, probably circa 1849, but there's no context of the environ of the farm in the sketch. However, Olmsted has captured in the distant viewshed the steamers and sailing ships on Raritan Bay as seen from his porch. In an 1848 letter to Frederick Kingsbury, he wrote, "I do exceedingly enjoy the view. Sometimes it is wondrous beautiful. I'm sure you would like Staten Island." Olmsted's time on Staten Island is remarkable not so much for the landscape designs he initiated on the farm, which were informed by the most prominent landscape gardener of that time, Andrew Jackson Downing, but for the social connections he established there, which enabled him to first enter the literary field. His neighbors included the publisher George Palmer Putnam, some of whose books we just saw, poet William Cullen Bryant, and railroad tycoon William Henry Vanderbilt. Olmsted certainly worked the land, planted seeds, and grafted saplings, particularly pear trees for the nursery trade at his Staten Island farm, but the substance of his time on Staten Island is to be found in the seeds sown in Olmsted himself to first pursue writing and then what would eventually be called the discipline and practice of landscape architecture. When Olmsted set sail for Staten Island in 1848, there was no identifiable profession called landscape architecture. The term itself was as embryonic as Olmsted was in his professional pursuits. As many of you may know, one of the earliest instances known of the term landscape architecture in the English language appeared only 7 years prior in Scottish botanist and gardener J.C. Loudon's 1841 book, Landscape Gardening and Landscape Architecture of the late Humphrey Repton, Esquire. And it appears as follows. These writings are full of the most valuable instruction for the gardener relative to the general composition of the landscape scenery and landscape architecture. Repton, of course, was known for his red books, and here are some images of that theory and practice of landscape architecture. The red books were portfolios of the garden plans and these fabulous before and after views of country estates that he designed in England. In the United States, however, and just a few of these before and afters, in the United States, the exemplar of the landscape gardener, a term we know Olmsted later very much avoided, the profession of that time in the United States was the aforementioned Andrew Jackson Downing. Olmsted not only knew of Downing at that time through his writings, particularly popular A Treatise on the Theory and Practice of Landscape Gardening adapted to North America, as well as Downing's journal, The Horticulturist. But he had in fact met Downing at his estate and nursery farm in Newburgh along the Hudson River. Olmsted's approach to farming, particularly on Staten Island, would be influenced by Downing's philosophy on landscape gardening as articulated in the treatise. Downing's treatise was a primer on the English landscape aesthetic, ranking the so-called picturesque style as the ideal, given its elegance in composition, expression, and form. We might also say that it's the ideal is also, oh, this music is so beautiful. We might also say that the elegance of that picturesque style, we might call that a practice, as we've been discussing today, of or an aesthetics in some ways of smoothing, as in the conversation we just had with Thaisa, Sarah, and others, or a reduction of friction. The influence on Downing and his landscape theory on Olmsted is manifold. First, Downing's writings, particularly in The Horticulturist, informed Olmsted's scientific approach to farming. Second, Downing's work inspired Olmsted to write. Downing even published some of Olmsted's earliest works in The Horticulturist. Downing also wrote letters of introduction for Olmsted's trip to England in 1850. Finally, in what is arguably the most significant introduction in the history of landscape architecture in the United States, Downing introduced Olmsted to Calvert Vaux, an English architect and draftsman, whom Downing had brought over to work as his pencil at his landscape gardening firm in Newburgh. Following Downing's death in a steamboat accident in 1852, Downing would soon become Olmsted's most distinguished collaborator, helping develop the Greensward Plan for Central Park in 1857 and as the primary designer of Prospect Park in Brooklyn, among numerous other projects by the Olmsted-Vaux partnership. Shortly before Vaux's death in 1895, Olmsted credited his own identity and career as a landscape architect to his former partner. And here's that quote: "I should have had nothing to do with the design of Central Park or of Prospect Park, had not Vaux invited me to join him in those works. But for this invitation, I should not have been a landscape architect. I should have been a farmer." But all of this was yet to come for Olmsted. When he set sail for Staten Island in 1848, he knew Downing's work and had read his writings, but he was still searching for what would become his vocation. In terms of the physical design of Olmsted's farm on Staten Island, there's no extant evidence or drawings of Olmsted's planning and management of the farm. He was merely a gentleman farmer trying to make a profitable business, but there is no indication that he was making physical drawings to lay out and operate the Staten Island farm. According to Charles Cappan McLaughlin and Charles Beveridge, Olmsted applied Downing's theories of landscape gardening when laying out his farm on Staten Island, particularly noting that Olmsted took to heart Downing's plea that his fellow citizens should tastefully arrange and embellish their dwellings and property for both convenience and beauty. In terms of drawings and plans, Olmsted did offer, in a November 24th, 1851 letter to the Horticulturist, a one-to-one sketch of a Soldat laboureur pear, the crop he imported from France and harvested as his primary investment at the farm, influenced by Downing's other influential book, The Fruit Trees of North America. And you can see this letter here. Even in Olmsted's circa 1849 sketch of the farmhouse, there's no context of those farm environs or how he might have been drawing the farm. To get a sense of Olmsted's landscape work at the Staten Island farm, there are two documents that provide the most detail. The first is a late in life reminiscence by Olmsted's wife, who in fact shows up on that plan. She was a neighbor and, of course, previously married to his brother John, Mary Cleveland Perkins. The second document is a recollection by Mr. Frederick Kingsbury, a friend of Olmsted, which was recorded in 1903. Each was published in the first compilation dedicated to Olmsted, 40 Years of Landscape Architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted, Landscape Architect, edited by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and Theodora Kimball in 1922. Mary Perkins offered a description of the initial visit to the Ackerley farm by Olmsted and his father, John Olmsted, in the summer of 1847, which persuaded them to purchase the 130-acre farm for $12,000, the equivalent of approximately $433,500 today. She also detailed the physical conditions of the farm and noted Olmsted's approach to farming. According to Perkins, the approach to the farmhouse was through a stand of trees, in quotes, of fair size, oaks, maples, sweet and sour gum, sassafras, holly, etc. After crossing through the stand of trees, the land opened to a clearing atop a small rise in soil of a heavy red clay suitable for wheat. The land sloped gently down to the beach, offering a view out to the sea and the New Jersey environ, Sandy Hook and Navesink, and all of the outward and inbound shipping. According to Perkins, there were no trees on this level, with the exception of one tall old pear tree, at the foot of which were found, this is a quote from Perkins, which were found from time to time the bones of the slaves who had been buried there, end quote. Notable here is not only the detail of a possible burial ground of enslaved people, but also the single pear tree that might have persuaded the gentleman farmer Olmsted to follow the precedent of the land in selecting pears as the primary crop of the farm's nursery. Perkins' recollection suggests as much, particularly noting that Olmsted planted fruit trees as part of the development of a nursery, particularly pears, in a simple, she says in quotes here, in a simple, inexpensive way, using the old buildings on the place and practicing rigid economy. Olmsted's letters from 1850 indicate that he planned to plant 5,000 imported pear trees grafted onto quince tree stock on the site. That's the extent of Perkins's recollection of the Staten Island farm. Kingsbury, for his part, provided a detailed description of Olmsted's landscape improvements as edited by Olmsted Jr. Kingsbury contrasts the initial appearance of the farm with Olmsted's improvements, which suggest Downing's influence. The house was simple yet picturesque. The barns were quite near, and in the rear of the house was a small pond, 15 or 20 feet in diameter, used for washing wagons, watering stock, and a swimming place for dogs, ducks, and geese. There was no turf near it. The whole place was dirty and disorderly, as the most bucolic person could desire. It was on the surroundings of the house that Olmsted first showed his genius in landscape construction. He moved the barns and all their belongings behind a knoll. He brought the road in so that it approached the house by a graceful curve. He turfed the borders of the pond and planted water plants on its edge and shielded it from all contamination. Thus, with a few strokes and at a small expense, he transformed the place from a very dirty, disagreeable farmyard to a gentleman's house, end quote. This is the most direct evidence of Olmsted's landscape designs at Staten Island. We can see similar precedents in the work of Humphrey Repton, another smoother, with the development of picturesque ponds as a part of his before and after country estate designs. The success of these improvements of Olmsted's Staten Island farm can be inferred from one of his neighbors, the eventual railroad promoter William Henry Vanderbilt, who asked Olmsted to make such improvements to his own farm on Staten Island. Other indirect evidence of Olmsted's landscape improvements come in the form of cylindrical drainage tiling system he writes of installing at his farm, which removed excess water from the soil by way of a network of tile pipes laid under the fields. This drainage tiling technique, which he had learned about in England, would be developed as part of his later work in Central Park with sanitary and drainage engineer George E. Waring, who would rent the lodging at the Staten Island farmhouse. Both men connected farming techniques to so-called sanitary strategies for achieving public health in an urban context. In many ways, Olmsted's social connections on Staten Island proved to be more constructive than the architectural endeavors on the farm. His two neighbors were the distinguished George Palmer Putnam, who would encourage Olmsted to travel to England and compile his writings into a book, the newspaper editor and poet William Cullen Bryant, who, along with Downing, was one of the first to call for a large-scale urban park for the city of New York. When Olmsted's brother John Hull Olmsted and his friend Charles Loring Brace, who were also part of Olmsted's social circle, on Staten Island during this time, planned to embark upon a trip to England in 1850, Olmsted, envious of their wanderlust, wrote to his father and pleaded that he be allowed to abandon the Staten Island farm for most of that growing season. Olmsted suggested that his father reckon up the money lost by the absence and compare it with the money value of my experience among English and Scottish farmers, end quote, thereby implying that he would learn from the trip, what he would learn from the trip and eventually apply such experience to the Staten Island farm. Olmsted's father granted permission, and Olmsted set off for England, a trip that would produce several of Olmsted's social writings, such as The People's Park at Birkenhead, New Liverpool, published under Olmsted's pen name Wayfarer by Downing in The Horticulturist in May 1851. Here, Olmsted reflects on his impressions of this 120-acre public park designed by Joseph Paxton. The park had also impressed his future partner, Calvert Vaux, and would influence their designs for both Central Park and later Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Upon his return stateside, Olmsted found support for his writing in none other than his neighbor, George Putnam, who encouraged Olmsted to develop his writings for the English trip in the 2-volume Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, published in 1852. In that work, we see his interest again in the nautical world, describing both ships and farming techniques, including the effectiveness of drainage tiles in an agricultural context. With the success of that publication, Olmsted would embark that same year upon a literary journey that took him south and west to the United States, producing the 3 major books in the span of 5 years, culminating in The Cotton Kingdom, which we heard from Sarah yesterday, between 1852 and 57. His attention during those 5 years was on writing, not farming, but it was through the lens of his early years of farming and wayfaring to and from the Staten Island Tassamak Farm that we find the origins of Olmsted's interconnected and complicated ideas of public space and public health, later manifest and drawn, perhaps by Vaux, in the Greensward Plan and Central Park. Thank you. Oh, there's still one more.
It's wonderful to be here. Let me echo the thanks to Samantha and Paige and Matt and Kat, and then as well to Ed, wherever he is. Oh, there you are. You keep moving around, Ed. You know, it was 25 years ago, this time of year, that I had the good fortune of being a Loeb Fellow at Harvard. And in my first weeks at the GSD, the Canadian Center for Architecture Traveling Exhibition had come to Harvard, and there were a series of panel discussions that were choreographed by Susan Taylor in concert with the Academy. And I remember the opening panel as we interrogated Olmsted on the 175th anniversary, now I realize, was titled Olmsted Legacy or Lethargy, and it was moderated by George Hargraves. And there was a lot of friction in that room that day. And the Olmsted Mafia were out in full force, and they were loud. And I just want to say how extraordinarily different this experience is to sort of parachute in and to see the vulnerability, the openness, the generosity of all of the presentations today, which so many of us are doing works in progress here and thinking in a very exposed way. And so I just want to say how exciting it is to be here at this time at the GSD while such a fertile and open conversation is taking place. So thank you to all involved. Initially, when this was titled, it was reflecting on the Renaissance, but what I realized and has been confirmed today is Olmsted is with all of us. Sometimes we exceed our 2 carry-on maximum, but he is ever present in our life journey that we have. And so what I'd like to do today is sort of really unpack what we can learn from what has happened since the great exhibition here under Alpine and Newton when we had the anniversary of the term landscape architecture reaching its centennial in 1963. And the other thing I want to do in particular, and this is a shout out to Rosetta, is that, we always have this debate about Olmsted and the term landscape architect. It's unavoidable. And what I'd like to do today is to really refine that to say that not only did Olmsted invent the term landscape architect here in the US, although we recognize it was imported, but also the idea of landscape activism. And in particular to the students that are here today, as we look at ethics and values through the lens of Olmsted and what we decide to tackle in our lives, I ask you to think about where landscape activism comes in and how much of a warrior are you willing to be? Because when we look at Olmsted, this was a person who was fairly Teflon coated, and we all saw over the last 2 days his health has suffered because of that. So with that, let's explore the Olmsted in all of us. It's been interesting to me to see who has their favorite Olmsted pictures through all of these presentations. I was expecting Olmsted as Santa Claus to be far more popular than it was. In fact, the winner was Olmsted with hot cheekbones and Greek sailor hat. So Olmsted popularized this before John Lennon and Zorba the Greek. All kidding aside, this is my Fred talk. And at the core of this, I want to really sort of unpack what is it about the love? What is it about the love that angers others? What is it that it has allowed Olmsted to be this kind of focus of all of this energy beyond the built work? And what is it about the love that begins during his lifetime? I was intrigued to learn over these last couple of days about the differences of opinion between Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer and Olmsted in relation to particular projects, but even during his lifetime, during the same period of this friction, if you will, she was celebrating his work as the fourth of the great fine arts alongside architecture, sculpture, and painting, and getting people outside of the metropolitan to see another great work of art. As someone who has spent my career in large part in the last 25 years looking at the legacy of those that came before us, I've had the good fortune of knowing a lot of individuals who, many of which went through the GSD and wrestled with Olmsted themselves. This is some paraphernalia that was in Larry Halpern's office that bas-relief hung over his desk. Halpern would reflect for me in our oral history series how he wanted to have a little bit of Olmsted in the FDR Memorial and how he did that with his stone selection. Halpern, like so many, in particular Carol Johnson, would talk about how somehow Olmsted was in their subconscious. It wasn't something that was ever really purposeful. If we think about the passing of the baton, if you will, one generation to the next. Here's the young Rich Haig in Halpern's office in 1959, and he is sort of really thinking more about, as a Seattleite, having to live and reconcile a legacy where the firm practiced for more than 3 decades. We can see him passing the baton to a very young, geeky, if you will, Laurie Olin, sorry, Laurie, who is sort of noting how Olmsted is the General Eisenhower of the discipline, and goes on to note how Olmsted saw that the city was the problem, and he saw how to deal with it, and he worked to the scale of the problem. Johnson and Oberlander as well, 2 other GSD graduates. Johnson, who was in the basement at Robinson Hall during her time here, she and Oberlander both are introduced to Olmsted, let alone the concept of landscape architecture, to the women's college campuses at Wellesley and Smith, noting the clarity of the Olmsted concept of building on the hills and leaving the valley open. Johnson and Oberlander, I love the placement of the buildings around the pond. So this is something that I think, again, that's a little tiny taste of the Olmsted in them, if you will. What I like to do with the rest of my time is look at sort of 2 phases of the Renaissance. The first one was wonderfully unpacked for us by Ed in his opening remarks. I'll look at sort of the next period, which we touched upon briefly with the founding of the Central Park Conservancy in Ethan's talk last night, and then close with, I won't do a dozen ways to expand, I'll share those with you and then look at 2. So first, the Renaissance. It was mentioned yesterday of Al Fine being approached by Norman Newton, who's working in concert with ASLA National to do something for the for the centennial of the term landscape architecture. The other thing to note here during this entire period is Fairstead is facing an uncertain future. And the politics are escalating, and the place is falling apart. Sidney Shercliffe is the kind of connective tissue with the Washington wonks that gets the GSD to elevate the discourse. And as I mentioned in my question yesterday, what's incredible to me is to look at the roster of people who were young people working on this effort, who all went on to play formative roles in the last half of the last century in terms of landscape history and academia and practice. I also found myself thinking last night during Ethan's presentation. Before this presentation, I didn't know who Michael Weinmayer was. Some of you, Gary, you look surprised. But I found myself thinking about, here's a person who did a master plan for Franklin Park. Then we have the master plan for Franklin Park done by Halverson. Now we have yet another plan. And to look at the values that are embodied in these plans over these decades through the lens of Olmsted, to me is quite interesting. But what's also interesting is to see this is the foundations. And Fine is the cornerstone for all of this. Fine daylights all of Olmsted's earlier writings with an essay, an introductory essay that is often referenced by many scholars as being influential. When I was a student, Frederick Law Olmsted and the environmental tradition was still being used. And in the middle, of course, is the publication that grew out of the Harvard exhibition, as well as a reprint of Walks and Talks. We've heard the name Dr. Charles McLaughlin over these last several days. Charlie actually is brought in to review this for Landscape Architecture magazine in '69. He refers to it as the reader having left to a do-it-yourself reader for Olmsted scholarships, era. These new Olmsted books have brought a bewildering array of source material to the general reader. With them on our shelf, we are much closer to an informed appreciation of Olmsted's great accomplishments than ever before. Yesterday, we also got a taste of the exhibition that came to Washington, D.C. Carter Brown, of course, director of the National Gallery at the time, refers to Olmsted as one of America's most prescient and sensitive artists. Shout out to Ethan Carr for referring to Franklin Park as a work of landscape architecture. This is a lineage that begins with Mariana Griswold Van Rensselaer and this quest in my personal Olmsted space of elevating landscape architecture to the art form that it is often struggling to be recognized by a greater populace. The exhibition, of course, is in New York and Washington. I could not resist this quote by Ada Louise Huxtable. If the two major exhibitions running concurrently does not establish the protein talent of Frederick Law Olmsted, Charlton Heston will have to play him. A bit more of the brochure we saw yesterday from the National Gallery exhibition that Bill Alex worked on with Jane Loeffler. The other thing here is 72 is also the origins of the Olmsted Papers. And although the first paper isn't published for 5 years, you see this momentum. 1 year later, Laura Wood Roper, the seminal biography, Flow. I do love that the Times Wayback Machine has Olmsted with an A. 4 years after this, I think Arlene Levy is still suffering from carpal tunnel from the microfiche of the 27,000 microfiche reels back in the day that we all whirled through like a carnival wheel. Those came on the scene and began the kind of research foundation that we were all in need of. And then we have Al Fine also brokering the gift to the GSD of the John Charles Olmsted papers and collections, and in particular 5,000 letters and communications. We've seen a taste of them over these last 2 days that are incredibly evocative back home to his wife. And again, I want to just come back to Fairstead because for those of us that are working today, we have a romantic notion of this place because of the way Fairstead looks and because of the way we see it in these earlier photographs and plans. 2 Harvard students at that time that were going back and looking at it. I'll reflect on them in a moment, but first, here is, believe it or not, Fairstead in 1977. And here are the reflections of Stu Dawson and Ed Dougherty. Stu notes, other than Norman Newton's passion and respect for Olmsted, we never even visited Olmsted's office. Ed had a 2-week internship in the office, and he notes, it was a place in shambles. As a business, as a professional office, it was hardly active. I think we're not aware of this, and I do love the swimming pool Polaroid. You just have to wonder what that was like when that was there, but I'll keep us on schedule. So now we have part 2. And I said the Olmsted and Us, so you get to see me with my David Cassidy hair as a Stumpy at Syracuse. I'm a native New Yorker, if you couldn't tell by my accent, and my personal connections to Olmsted are because of Central Park. I remember waiting 14 hours to get my free tickets to see the Pirates of Penzance. I was in the rain for Diana Ross. I saw the gates. I did not experience Barbra Streisand. I only knew of the lore. But I did, like so many of you. And I ask all of you, as you look at these images, I defy you to not have what the National Register would call the 7th aspect of integrity, feeling, and association. There is an immediate connection with that place that is immediate. It's just inescapable. So if we are saying that it starts here, let's pull back a little further to get to the bottom of this. 1980. Fairstead becomes a unit of the National Park Service. It's saved. The National Association for Olmsted Parks is founded, and Central Park Conservancy is founded. All of these things happen in the same year. This is seismic for a movement. The next year, the Metropolitan Museum, Art of the Olmsted Landscape, opens. I remember walking past Burgers of Calais and the Gates of Hell to find my way to Olmsted at the Metropolitan as a 4th-year undergraduate student. And it was just mind-boggling. And then you open the catalog, and once again we have Mr. Fine. Since the 50s, he's emerged from relative obscurity to national prominence. His varied contributions as a theorist, planner, designer, administrator are relevant to the needs of the nation today. What gives Olmsted's Renaissance a special dimension is that so many of his communal creations, although badly in need of maintenance and repair, are still mostly intact and vital to communities surrounding them. And then finally, Olmsted's Renaissance therefore derives from the continuing relevance of his work and his ideas in which his efforts were based. Looking sideways, same period, here in Massachusetts, what I used to refer to as the Massachusetts Olmsted Mafia were once again leading by example with the first state-level landscape survey of Olmsted designs. We see our friends at BU and Radcliffe here as well. And this is what it all looked like. Most of these pictures are mine. Top left is Patricia O'Donnell in Prospect Park on what was a lakeside shelter. The love continued. Why is that when these places look that way? Well, now we have the foundations, Charlie and Charlie. They're part of this new organization, and they get their act together and they take it on the road. Throughout the US, they go to Liverpool, they go to parks in other cities, they constituency build, they build awareness, they build an army of advocates. And it's incredible. You go to these places, these are photos I took in the late 80s, that's Dr. Beveridge in the foreground, in Iroquois Park, which we saw earlier in Tim's presentation, Louisville, Shawnee River. And I just want to take a moment today because this conference has been about context for me and how we define this. And Arlene, you have to behave yourself because I'm going to have a little moment with you right now. The work that I do, I didn't know this at the time, but I was literally shaped by these extraordinary and fearless women. And in asking Arlene about what was the motivation for all of these varied people, sometimes lawyers, sometimes historians, but other times mothers, parents that had kids leaving the nest is she said, quote, "We weren't quite burning our bra, but we were looking for a growth experience that was personal and collective." And they were incredible in what they did. They literally took it to Congress. They tried to pass Olmsted legislation. Sadly, it did not happen. Here's Patricia O'Donnell with the late Phil Winslow. And then it trickled into the discipline. Landscape architects were the beneficiaries of a new attitude about urban parks. The Department of Environmental Management here under Dukakis, 12 parks, $12 million. The work in Central and Prospect Park. It then spilled out throughout the country. And then the conservancies exploded like rabbits. They were everywhere. And it grew out of this concept of a nonprofit public-private partnership. So, quite simply, my philosophy is this is a model that can be replicated. Start with love, some badass women, some brilliant scholars, and then the archives themselves, the foundations. You have the movement. And the foundation for this movement is the work. And the work is incredible. It is both large-scale, park-specific, traveling exhibitions, children's books, publications that I think don't even, they defy convention. Nonfiction based on fictional characters, nonfiction with conjecture, and then a biography that's as much about a park as it is about a person. All with Olmsted confessionals being inside of those people displayed, postage stamps, documentaries, Olmsted's writings, of course. All of this is the necessary foundations. And this leads me to a wonderful quote by the great Grady Clay when he spoke at a National Association for Olmsted Parks meeting in 1983. He says, "I was wrong-headed enough to think some years back this well-meaning little enterprise would flutter into public view, then disappear among the host of good causes that never get anywhere. It was all quite inspiring. I felt I was present at the moment the whole thing had finally achieved critical mass and would become a movement," which it did. And so what's so clear to me is if you want metrics of their success of this movement, look at the National Register programs. I believe there are more Olmsted firm design landscapes on the National Register than any designer in American history. I'm going alphabetically here, and this is incomplete. This is basically based on what I can find. But when you look and stack up the places, it's absolutely extraordinary. And this has all happened because of a movement that just happened. And then finally, these are National Historic Landmarks. There's about 3 dozen. So there's only about 2,800 National Historic Landmarks in the US, and more than 30 have Olmsted involvement. In closing, I want to leave you with just a forward-looking series of thoughts. I'm not going to read this, but I will just sort of walk through these last 3 red ones. It'll just take a minute. This is sort of the bane of my existence. But what was so incredible is now that all this material's online, I didn't realize it was a problem for the firm as well. These are their super graphics from the Olmsted office. And one more, which is very Halpern-esque with the pointy finger. The other thing, of course, this is the actual National Register nomination put forward for the property. So yeah, maybe on an update down the road. We've already had definitions of advocate or activists earlier today, but I just want to conclude with these ideas of Olmsted being fearless. Imagine leaving New York in 1879 and then writing at your own expense and publishing a paper called The Spoils of the Park, referring to the leadership there as a disorganized body has been masquerading before the public, a headless trunk without policy, without order, without well-defined purpose. We saw this image yesterday, and we heard about the underpaid folks that were on that exposition that were Chinese. This had a Chinese chef. I don't know what was on the menu, but it's clear that with the Speaker of the House that this was curated. This was a seduction to get policy passed. I won't read the quote on the right here, but this is in the report, and it's just extraordinary to me in terms of looking at how we manage change and what our values are through the lens of Olmsted. We see similar quests from Olmsted's leadership on Rock Creek Park in Washington as the focus is on the U.S. Capitol grounds and not on the farmland that would provide a dignified gateway to the district. We see, of course, the same at at Niagara Falls with the quest to focus on the masses. And American waterfronts, to move those away from industrial use and to claim them and capture them for civicness before it's too late. And then in conclusion, broadening our lenses and how we look at Olmsted. One of the things that's been interesting to me today is we haven't really talked almost anything about any of the women that were in the office. And I do love this cartoon because, the draftsmen were much younger than most of the women in the office. And in fact, this is a holiday card from 1932-33. Look at all the signatures. Who were these people? I will tell you that I've tried noodling around and I'm having a very hard time. Helen Bullard, which Arlene Levy has told me there is no known photo of, but you always can identify her by her bustle and bun, was the highest paid female employee in the office. I'm curious, did the women have a lunchroom? Because the men did. It was celebrated with this image in the archives. Where were they having their lunch? What about Marion? We talk about the Olmsted brothers. There was a sister in there. We've just been here for 2 days. I didn't hear her name come up once. All these things are questions. I have no answers, just questions to close with. And earlier, Ed and I were talking about Stella. What is the story here? And so there's still much to unpack in the practice in terms of how this office worked and what everyone's contributions were. And the same could be said for the next gens. We just saw P.R. Jones in Ed's comments. As a Washingtonian, I can say his impact was incredibly significant during Junior's years on the Commission of Fine Arts. There are many more stories to unpack here. And then, what about the larger cultural construct? Who were these people? What are the Natalilies that were building the Bradley estate in Georgia, which is today a museum? Who was this young person that was working at Biltmore for Olmsted? Olmsted, in celebration of his new Leica camera at the Everglades, taking this photograph. So cultural lifeways are being noted here. What are we learning about these places and these people? Here at the LSU campus, for example, this image is labeled Indian Mounds. It was respected in the design in the same way that the earthworks were at Grant Park in Atlanta. And then when we read the public parks being the property of the people shall be open to all persons upon absolutely equal terms, what does that mean in Baltimore or in Birmingham? In Baltimore, here's a drawing signed by Olmsted Jr. for 2 different playgrounds, one at a higher ground, one for black children, and one for white children. There's a lot to unpack here. These are the next chapters of research. This is in the Olmsted collections. You'll notice the pencil notes here. White slums, colored slum project, blighted areas. I show you these not knowing a whole lot and other than having a lot of questions. But there are frontiers and there are avenues that need to be unpacked in our own shared journey of the Olmsted for all of us. And the last thing I want to end with here is that remarkably, and I've been following this like it's Jerry Lewis's telethon, as of October 12th, 201,349 images have been scanned. And so it is because of that accessibility that we can do the work we've been doing very recently at the Cultural Landscape Foundation because of the free ability to actually publish this material. So hats off to all that have been involved in that. That is my Fred talk, and thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for that. What a wonderful panel to conclude with after these 2 days. There were notes of collaboration and influence across all of your talks, and especially, Charles, your conclusion with sort of thinking about the legacy of Olmsted and on future generations. I wonder if we can start just by reflecting a little bit about what you expect the legacy of these 2 days of collaboration and influence might be on your own thinking. I know we have 2 self-identified non-Olmsted scholars, but maybe just thinking a little bit about how all of these conversations have started to percolate with your own work.
I guess for me, what is so enticing over these last 2 days is to see how varied everyone's backgrounds have been. And I just think the openness of the dialogue is just so fertile for new investigations. I mean, last night at dinner, our table was talking about the sailing presentation. And it was so interesting to me to see, depending on which discipline someone was coming at this from, how different the takeaways were for everyone at the table last night. And I think what they all shared, though, was a broadening of questions that we're asking about not just what Olmsted's legacy means, but other ways in which Olmsted's legacy has not really been analyzed. And so I think that, it's funny, because one of the things I've been thinking about, just sort of skipping ahead, is, we treat the Olmsted papers like the Holy Grail. And I guess one of the things that I've been thinking about over these last several days in the 12 volumes of massive material that we have, which, for me, it's always been, oh, great, I don't have to try to read that other stuff because it makes me crazy. But I do find myself sort of wondering, what that sieve was. And in the lenses that we're speaking about today, is there going to have to be another revisitation of the primary source material to look for things that we weren't looking for then? And that just seems really, I see all these heads nodding right now, and that seems like, oh my God, this is like painting the bridge. We just finished, and now we get to do it all over again. So I guess that's my reflection.
Sure. Oh.
How about you? Do you have any reflections, my friends?
Well, it's been a great series of talks. Obviously, I've been really inspired by everyone's research, really, really powerful. I'm really intrigued by the questions of language. I think that's really what Olmsted trafficked in best. And in some ways, the conversation about, is it friction? Is it scales or smooth? What does it mean to be topographic? What does it mean to be an advocate? I think all of those ways that we define ourselves really are open for questioning and deep questioning in many cases. I think what also I find very compelling, and I know Ed has brought me to this in some ways through Mr. X, but the use of a different name for oneself, I think, is really a good lesson for all of us. I've been trying some writing with an assumed name. That's all I'll say. But see if you can find it. But yeoman and wayfarer are ways of looking at the world and lenses through which Olmsted approached things which were very unknown to him. And I think we all need to have a kind of sort of let go of our own names in some ways and come to some other place to kind of open our perspectives and be othered in a way. So.
Also around Menhaden.
I kept trying to find Menhaden. Where is that?
It's in I'll send it to you. It's in a Connecticut agricultural newspaper.
Yeah.
So that was his first ever published piece of writing. Yeah.
Oh, there's a question, Doug.
As I'm not an American, I will play the agent provocateur. So first of all, I don't think it's 1963, the 100th anniversary. It came into the language at 1860. That's not the point. My thing is what you proposed. I mean, I think that was 2 days that really opened something, and I'm a little bit worried that we close it. And let me explain. So my very first seminar I had in Vienna was about the international style by Henry Russell Hitchcock. The Philip Johnson. And basically, they had an exhibition at the MoMA, and then there was an international style. And what I did was what was left out. There was so many wonderful architecture, different architecture that didn't reflect. And there never was an international style. And so I would say if you have a national register of preserved monuments where 2/3 of it is Olmsted, this should be a red flag. Because in a way, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have all these, like movements, and then it gets on a register, and it gets. And so my question as an outsider would be, what is not on the registry? And why is it not on the registry? And who has the power to put the things in the registry, and so on, and so on, and so on? Yeah, that's my agent provocateur question here.
Well, and just to respond to that, I mean, I should say that the National Register has about 84,000 properties in the U.S., and so there's over 200 by Olmsted and his successor firm. But the reason why that's the case is that there is the necessary contextual analysis. And everything that we've been speaking about over these last 2 days, these new contexts that are burgeoning, the publishing is critical. Because, and this is why I say publish or perish, the publishing enables the contextual analysis. And the only other thing I would say about this is you have to recognize that since that program was created, with the Historic Preservation Act of '66, that we've seen funding go like this, right? So federal and state, and we see landscape history going like this. So what we have to do is leverage that, because the resources are not at the federal or state level to provide that contextual analysis. So if we publish, if we make these places visible, there are the tools to get them designated. And with designation, at least in terms of federal and state dollars, comes protection. And protection is critical.
I kind of wanted to add, I'm interested in hearing other people's thoughts to that excellent question, but I just sort of wanted to add a little bit, maybe the same question in another context. It's sort of a question for you, Ed, in response directly to your paper, but it's also maybe a question for all of us after this weekend, is sort of, one thing that I really got from your talk is sort of this Olmsted who has a clear vision, both for how he sees himself and how he wants other people to see him, and also how he sees cities and how he wants us to see cities. And I'm wondering if, sort of in conversation with Annette's question, if for someone who is so prolific on paper and in the physical geography and the social geography of our lives, how can we see past or imagine beyond that? I mean, does Olmsted leave us room to see the stories he's not interested in his work? Does the way he's physically shaped our cities and our lives, and from the day-to-day to the sort of epic scale, is there room to sort of imagine alternative uses or understandings of those spaces, given how sort of embedded they are in both our physical and social geographies? So it's sort of that same question, but maybe longer.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Alex. Two quick responses, and I don't mean this glibly, but I'm not particularly interested in Olmsted's spaces as such. I'm interested in the papers, and I don't want to give, I'm sad if I gave the misimpression that Olmsted had a clear vision, because I think he didn't. He was a very deeply internally conflicted person. He's self-doubting. That's why I call him Olmsted polytropos. He's always changing direction and
Maybe someone seeking a vision.
yeah, and the reason I highlighted Civilization, the book, which is, it's this gigantic mass of aporia, and he can't quite reconcile what he needs to see in America based on his experience on the frontier and the barbarity conditions, whatever. So no, my response is, if anything, biographies create a whole and a unity. Again, that Shakespearean give a name and local habitation to lofty ideas. He never got the home address. So the idea of the possible Olmsted paper is clearly it's playing into my predilection for minor, nugatory, marginal histories, because I do want to write about the urn analysis and the wallpaper and everything else. And also, there's just, as everyone has said in their own way the past years, there's so much more. And a lot of it, it's not even that it's not flattering or not, it's just, it's not the Olmsted that we've had need for. And I'm saying maybe we need another Olmsted, or want, or desire him. One last thing, because the word keeps coming up, and Thaisa kept promoting Dumbarton Oaks, so I feel like I can do some promotion today. But one of the side pieces that led to this particular, the materiality of the paper is this paper I wrote a few years back on tribology, or the science of friction, because Olmsted Jr. Invented a pencil sharpener, and had a loop of sandpaper in it, because if you want to point, you have to wear away the matrix. So, and also Gilpin talks about the voluble pencil, but volubility and friction are essential to this trade. Everything from the tooth of the paper we write on to the kind of supposed smoothness of the greens, which was the great, everyone assailed Capability Brown on he was too smooth, right? Or Culpability Brown, as Depart calls him. But yeah, Alex, in sum, I hope in every way not to have given the sense of unity. That the whole point of the papers is that these are lives of, as all lives are, despite we want to tell ourselves, miscellany and narrative, or Kermode tells us a sense of an ending or closure, has us believe that end meets beginning and, all the rest. I don't believe in any of that, yeah.
And I think the other thing here is we keep saying Olmsted when we mean Olmsteds.
Yeah.
And that we've seen that today. So I think that's another piece of the puzzle.
And I'm going to add to that with my big mouth that Charles can expect, is that it's not only Olmsteds. It's not only Olmsteds, but it's this incredible firm of people whose name was Zach. And we all learned to call him Zach instead of Zach, because his name is spelled by Z-A-C-H. And, Dawson and Phillips, etc. They have persona. They have enormous creativity. They take the lessons and they expand them, extend them, meet new needs, meet new circumstances. They aren't monolithic. So if we have to do anything, we've got to start, and it's published issue, but it's also be careful in your language. We've been very loose. Granted, we're celebrating those gold balloons that say 200, and bravo to that. But let's make sure that we give the extent of the firm its credit.
Also, Eileen, I'd offer that this conference wasn't about the firm, and I think our panelists have been quite precise in their assignations of meaning to the various parts of Olmsted's career and legacy. But thank you for that comment. Yeah.
Yeah, Alex, I just wanted to add to your question. I interpreted it maybe in a slightly different way, or much greater way. I should take this off. That quantity of thinking and of work, more or less in very few decades, is very historically determined. I don't think we will ever have that opportunity. The world is built. And in terms of, now, does that mean that we are stuck with Olmsted ways of thinking? And I would say absolutely not. We see it, for instance, in the work that Gary presented last night. We see it in the many ways that these projects are going to be remade, reinterpreted, and in the many ways that we reinterpret our relationship to history. So we are no one, I mean, I can't imagine that anyone will have in this era the opportunity of designing a park that is 800 acres, 300 acres. I mean, that just is not going to happen. What we can do is in our interventions as we are called to, and you know, so Gary spoke about that yesterday, but we've heard it from Ned and what Friedman and what the Arboretum is doing to open up to the city, to become a more inclusive place, more social place, etc. And these are the fantastic things that are in the future of the field. We in our department, in terms of pedagogy, we have been studying Franklin Park for 10 years. And you saw some of that work pinned up. And I can tell you that there are no two projects alike, no two issues alike. Every student unearths a history, an issue, a problem. Sarah here did one of the most fantastic studio projects when she was a student in that studio. So I see the work on the one hand as very specific. It has a presence that is readily recognizable when you walk into an Olmsted landscape. And on the other hand, you know, that phrase that Ethan, his title yesterday on letting it be or letting it go or whatever, that openness, open-endedness in the work is also very inspiring, and it gives us, I think, the permission to reinterpret and to change and to, in a way, reconstruct or project to a future that will respond to the needs of the communities that are around those places. So yes, I think that's how it works. We're not stuck, no.
There's someone way in the back and there too. Yeah. And then Rosetta.
So I just want to say thank you so much, because I just want to highlight how important it is for documentation, for attention on landscapes around the country, around the world, in order to get funding. And we have to save 800 acres. We have to start moving towards saving larger landscapes again and using whatever strategies we can, because we have a climate and biodiversity crisis. We have less than 10 years. So I'm not, you know, I just want to highlight the urgency behind the climate and biodiversity crisis, and that whatever the cultural issues, the strategies, the typologies, they're very useful, especially as we're seeing, and I'm focused on waterways, 30 inches of rain dropping on Puerto Rico is unprecedented. That's almost almost more than half of the amount of rain that drops on Boston in a year. So the waterways are going to be dangerous. These tributaries are going to be dangerous. And Olmsted strategies are particularly useful. So thank you for letting me highlight the urgency, but to this panel, how can we get onto Olmsted next and springboard this into this discussion into the future?
Thank you for that last comment. I wanted to add, it's nice that it was placed there, because I wanted to add to Anita's remarks that if Olmsted was alive, the climate urgency would contour his work undoubtedly. The same way preserving, or you know, he never used that word, let's say, but honoring the lands and the drumlins were part of his language. So I think the question isn't so much formal, but what the takeaways are for the future, because we are going to have to get really good at unbuilding. The world is built, and that's part of the problem. And so an 800-acre park is around the corner. It's coming because we have to get out of the way. And so how are we as professionals taking the future seriously? And, you know, humbly, I'm not an Olmsted historian either, but I just think it would be really nice if the urgency of the pressures, I mean, are so relevant, and in some places there are means, and in some places there are not, to keep up with those changes. 1872, we haven't needed irrigation at the Arboretum ever. Yeah, we need it now. So it's a very minor example of what I think you're all nodding about. So we have to get good at unbuilding and making those spaces the way he was good at preserving and drawing a line around and saying, wait, just not here. And that development freeze mentality that he has, we have to import and kind of, so I suppose, what does the panel think of that? I'm sorry, I just spoke too much, and it didn't end in a question, but.
Well, I think what you set up as an answer there is, what is the role of activism? I don't know if I said this out loud to just a couple of people, but I was so inspired when I heard about the numbers of people that are visiting the Arboretum today. It's mind-boggling. And so how do we begin to turn this into votes? I mean, here in Massachusetts, in a 10-year period, we saw 3 museums raise $1 billion. $1 billion. 2 of them sit on the Emerald Necklace. So why is it that philanthropic Bostonians, when they give to the arts or the symphony, that it doesn't extend in the same way to the public realm in terms of our shared civic spaces? And so I turn that back to everyone in the room and say, okay, so you had the concept of landscape activism come up twice. If people are voting with their feet already in terms of where they're going in a post-COVID world, what are we going to do about that? Now, if I were going to have my little Olmsted seance in the way that you just did, I would say, well, Olmsted would write about it. So what does that mean in terms of this room as a room of influencers? However you want to interpret that. What are you going to do with that? How are you going to coalition build? What's the necessary foundation? Who are the badass women? I mean, one of them sitting right here. But I think it's on us. I mean, we can finger point, but at the end of the day, that what we've seen over these last 2 days are singular acts of bravery. And some of those have been personal quests. Some have played out privately and then played out publicly, maybe for the first time over these last 2 days. And others were people like me or Arlene, or dare I say you, with a big mouth, and happy to express that opinion, and thank God you do. But how do we actually get it to stick and to build and to leverage that? That's the challenge.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
No. I just want to add one thing, and I know, Paige, we have to end, but I'll say it again. I don't go outside very often, so I know the world's going to whatever, but I'm facing my own forms of extinction in the classroom, and you know, Tam, I was very tickled by your comment about you sprinkle English poetry in there, and the kids aren't interested in English poetry anymore, and the humanities, as I was taught it, are now very close to extinct, and that's fine. But I should mention that last year, Anita and I used the Frederick Law Olmsted lecture to invite Jamaica Kincaid, and the reason I did that is because in Lucy, you remember, Lucy is taught Wordsworth, you know, I float as lonely as a cloud. And if Olmsted was reading that, which he was, what does it mean for someone like Jamaica Kincaid to write? You know, what could English poetry mean now, and to whom, and where, and what have you? So I am fighting my own very lonely fight on other extinction fronts, and I just want to put that forward. And Olmsted could be an ally there as well, yeah.
Well, and since you opened the door on Jamaica Kincaid, I don't know if people in this room have read Jamaica Kincaid's essay that was published in the New Yorker about 15 years ago when she was asked to speak at a Garden Conservancy conference, and she took on the Calhoun statue. Nobody was taking on Civil War monuments at that time. And so again, it leads to a brave act of activism. She did that when she was invited there. She had hosts, and she took a position that was, no one was there at that time. It was an incredible act of bravery. And so for me, with all due respect, I feel bad that people are not reading the classics. But, at the other end of the spectrum here. But I think that, again, we have got to stand up. There is so much at risk. And I think the question I would say to the people who haven't really thought a lot about Olmsted, what can we be doing on this side for that coalition that might exist to sort of change that dynamic? What can we do to contribute to a larger cause?
Okay, referring back to one of my favorite authors again, Frank Kermode, The Sense of an Ending, we have reached the time of the big call.
Kairos, the time is ripe. So I must thank everyone, this panel, all of you for being, as Charles said, so incredibly generous and thoughtful and precise in your thinking and considering what Olmsted might be in the future for us. So thank you, everyone. Thank the audience, Gary, the department. So there's a reception outside, and please unbend.